Welcome back to the Agency Allies podcast, the show where we talk with the leaders who are shaping the future of branding, design, and advertising. I'm your host, Adam Testa. Today, my guest is Michael Farmer, CEO of Farmer and Company. Michael has spent decades agencies rethink how they work, how they price, and how they create real value for clients. He's the author of Madison Avenue Manslaughter and Madison Avenue Makeover, and brings a perspective that blends strategy, operations, and creative leadership in a way that few others can. So, Michael, we were just kind of discussing what, your, can I call it an agency or consultancy firm does. You've had a long career in consulting agencies. What led you to start Farmer and Company, and what exactly is Farmer and Company?
Okay, great. Good question. And Adam, thanks for having me here. It's always a fun subject to talk about. I'm a career management consultant. I got out of business school several decades ago and went to work for Boston Consulting Group in Boston and in Rio de Janeiro, and then later Bain and Company. And I ran 3 offices in Europe, Germany, France, and the UK. But, I missed consulting when I was running Bain London. It was, a very big operation, and I did nothing but sort of hassle with my partners and wasn't doing any work. So I wanted to start my own firm and get back to management, hands-on management consulting, and I did that in 1990. Now, as it turned out, 2 years after I started, and I was just doing Bain-type work, I had a call from Ogilvy in the UK, and they felt that they needed a strategy consultant because they were not happy with their profitability, and they weren't sure what was going on in the industry then in 92 that was causing a decline in their profitability in their operations. So I jumped in and did that first study, and I looked at it this way. We actually did help them and help them figure it out. Ogilvy had several hundred offices, and I thought, this is really fun. If we could do the same thing in all the other offices that have this kind of a problem, it could be a very interesting, set of consulting activities. So that's what we did. We pivoted back in 92 to become full-time, focus on agencies, I should say, and their clients, which were going through all the fee changes from media commission to fee-based. And it was a confusing time because no one was sure where the fees were going to go and what the basis would be and how they could actually calculate what a fee should be based on man hours. Like, how many man hours does it take to work on a client? We had to figure out that problem.
Yeah, I mean, I have a number of years. I have about 7 years in freelance brand strategy, and the pricing was always the most difficult part. So you're kind of if I could paint you with a broad stroke, you're kind of this very unique strategy consultant that is based in the advertising world. You help agencies with their pricing, and you kind of act like, a consultant for them.
Sure. Well, the thing is, Adam, it's just a subset of what I had been doing at Bain, except that it was focused on one particular industry. I mean, strategy consulting, which is what BCG and Bain and now McKinsey focus on, is helping senior executives figure out how to get more performance out of their companies. And as it turned out in advertising, the way I looked at it then and still do is they have a pricing problem. They're paid on the basis of man hours, but what they're actually doing is a whole lot of work, and they don't measure the work they're doing. So they're not paid for the work they do. They're paid for a guess at their man hours. And what actually has gone on, just to keep it simple, is that for the last 30 years, their workloads have grown enormously, particularly when digital and social advertising came in, around 2007, 8, 9. But since agencies don't really keep very good track of the deliverables they do, they were pretty unaware of the fact that their workloads were massively growing and their fees were not keeping pace with it. Procurement was setting fees based on some guess at man hours, and there was a gap between how much work was going on and the man hours they were being paid for. And that gap has only grown. So it has put enormous pressure on agencies. And what I've tried to do is to help them to understand that they need to shift the way they get paid They need to shift to the way they keep their data, and they need a model actually to, relate fees with what their workloads are. That's kind of my consulting expertise.
Interesting. So let's say, you probably work with like larger clients, but let's say you're talking casually talking to a guy on a podcast. He freelances. Let's say his rate is like $70 an hour, and that comes with like work about like web design or logo design, building any type of brand architecture. And he's doing 70 an hour, and that's just he's just a simple guy. What would you say to him? Would you say like you got to shift things around?
Well, it all depends. The real question is, when you get a new client, what are you agreeing to do, and how are you estimating the number of hours it's going to take to do it? Now, if you've got a single project like a website, you probably have the experience to be able to do that. I've done websites before. I know just about, how much it's going to take. I take a look at their current website. I think about the changes that are required. It's going to take me 4 months or 3 months or who knows what. And you can estimate that. The problem is when you get into an agency, not particularly a big one, but, like Ogilvy London back in those days was doing for 50 creatives, they were doing about 360. That's not a massive number of ads. Today, that number would be 15,000 ads. 15,000 ads. So because of all the digital and social, Instagram, Facebook, email marketing, search,
ads.
blah, blah, blah. So the question becomes, when you have these very large scopes of work that have a huge number of deliverables, and they span everything from doing websites to doing TV ads to doing Instagram posts, how do you figure out the number of man hours that's required for that? And the truth of the matter is, they don't. The client pretty much tells them what their fee is going to be. That's how it works these days. And then the agencies figure out how many people they can afford to do it. And they hope that the amount of work that marketing gives them, it doesn't exceed that. But of course, the fact is procurement setting the fees, marketing is setting the workloads, and that's a complete disconnect. So it's tough for them to get it right unless they start really doing some micro data gathering about the actual workloads, and then have a way of thinking about how many.
So you're making the claim that the model is broken, and the current broken model is that agencies don't know how many hours it takes to build so many different assets, do so many different things, and basically like because they don't know, it sounds like the client decides the pricing.
That's been pretty much the case. I won't say, Adam, that they don't know, because I think that if they had a scope of work in their hands at the beginning of a fiscal year, I think they could figure out from their vast experience how many man hours it would take. The problem is that clients aren't prepared to pay that, and agencies don't put forward all the arguments that they would make. The other thing is they don't get the scope of work all at once. They might have a sketch of what it's going to look like for the year. The client might say, look, we're gonna do 6 campaigns, and the campaigns will include, they'll all be omnimedia, so they're going to be everything from TV to Instagram. But nobody says, and it's going to involve 8,000 deliverables of different types. It's just not that precise. The other thing is the client is telling them what the fee is going to be. The arguments are really around the magnitude of the fee, not the magnitude of the workload. Because once the fee is set, then the agency wants that money, doesn't want to lose the client. And when the work starts dribbling in, and it's a massive amount of work, they're kind of reluctant to say, something, this is a lot more than we thought we would be getting for the $1 million or $2 million that you're paying us. Smaller independent agencies have the same problem, but because their relationships are smaller, it's more manageable. It's the big agencies that have a huge problem. I would add one thing, or maybe 2 things, Adam, that it isn't just in the pricing that things are broken. What else is broken is that the holding companies, when they have inadequate fees, require their agencies to downsize instead of fixing the pricing arrangement. And therefore, the other thing that's been going on for the last 30 years is that agencies have been liquidating their talent. And they've been merging brands and getting rid of senior level executives. They've gotten rid of their expensive mid-level executives. They really have a lot of very junior people today in the name of cost reduction. And then the third area in which it's broken is what you find when you look at the client's brand growth ever since this started with digital and social. Major advertisers have seen a very distressing decline in the growth rate of their brands. You could almost argue that the shift to digital and social stopped brand growth, that brand growth worked under the old traditional advertising programs and isn't working now, even though, of course, there are a lot of other things that are the cause for that. So we've got agencies liquidating their talent pool because they're underpaid, and you have clients that have a growth problem that leads them to change agencies all the time and to be very hard on fees. So, the whole thing is just not working very well for anybody.
How do we fix it, Mr. Farmer?
All
what
right.
can we
Well,
do?
I worked with one agency a couple of years ago, Huge, which was a digital creative agency based in Brooklyn that was part of IPG. And in 2021, they got a new chief executive, Max Baxter, who had been running a big media operation for IPG, and he went in there to turn it around. It hadn't been growing for about 8 years. And Matt called me up and said, "Hey, Farmer, I'm going to turn this thing around here in mind-bending ways. How would you like to be a fly on the wall and write a book about it while I'm doing it?" So I wrote a book about it, and I got to
This
observe.
big confidence. How would you
Well,
like
I
to
mean,
watch me succeed and write a book on me?
well, yeah, that's the way Matt is. And listen, that's the kind of chutzpah that you need to
Yeah.
take on an agency transformation. But Matt did a number of very important things that are, certainly in line with what I've been saying. The first thing he said was, I want to make sure that our people understand that the purpose that we have in working with clients is to get their brands growing again. That's our mission. Our mission is not to be creative. Our mission is not to create fancy websites. Our mission
Sales
is to
approach.
Our mission is to grow our clients' brands. Now, let me tell you, that's the only agency I've ever known that had that as a mission, because now more of them are doing that because I think they're imitating that particular thing. But Matt was serious about it. Second thing, and he mobilized his management team in offsite retreats to talk this through, got them all to sign up. That's right. That's the way we're going to think about our business. That's important, I think, Adam. Second thing is, he said, we're going to develop a whole new suite of products that have brand growth as the objective, and we will charge for the products, not for some guess at our man hours. That was the second thing he did.
So
and I think those two things are important.
Products, as in, tell me about these products that we're using. Are they?
Well, he felt that there were 3 areas that were getting in the way of his clients growing, his type of clients. They were very much a website designer and implementer. And he felt that in many cases, there were people that needed brand new websites that did a better job of attracting customers and allowing them to do e-commerce. There were other problems that clients had, too many platforms that didn't speak with one another and needed a full integration, etc. And there were other problems that they identified, so that they said, if our mission is to grow clients' brands, we want to have a suite of products in 3 distinct areas that address the kinds of problems we know we will have. And so they went off, the senior management team went off for a couple months and developed 15 products in 3 different areas, so 45 new products that they were going to sell as products to fulfill the, agency growth, the client product growth mission. And then they put a price tag on each one of them. They figured out what it would take in resources, what they needed in a profit margin, what kind of uncertainty they might come across in terms of the actual amount of work involved. And they set some pretty aggressive pricing targets so that they were outselling, in effect, their mission and their 45 products to chief marketing officers and chief technology officers. Now, I think those two things, Adam, agencies committing that they're going to be growing their clients' brands if they have the right scopes of work. Secondly, making sure that it's a right scope of work that will do the mission. And the third thing is get paid for the deliverables along some reasonable basis. Now, I've been pretty much saying the same thing, coming at it from a different place. I've just thought it's logical that if you're running an agency and you're creating deliverables that are supposed to grow brands, that you need to be paid for those deliverables rather than for some other proxy, which is man hours. And agencies have not flourished under the man hour system at all. It's been all downhill for 30.
That's all very interesting. Let's maybe gain some, I need context into what percent of agencies do you think are on how would you classify different fee models? Like just a time versus like project? What's the landscape that we're talking about?
There is time in project, but it all comes back down to man hours, even in a project. Like we were saying, if you got a website that you wanted to put together, you would figure out how many hours it's going to take, how many people is that, what's their billing rate for clients, and then add up what that fee is. Listen, back in around 2000, very end of media-based commissions, when agencies were paid 15% of what clients spent on media, everything shifted over pretty much so to what they call labor-based fees. Labor-based fees is what are the salaries of your people working on it? What kind of overhead do they incur? You know, for most agencies, for every dollar that they spend on salaries for client-facing people, they're spending $1 on overhead. 100%.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah. Well, let's say a person at an agency that's going to be on account is paid $100,000 a year. Okay. When the agency does its calculation of the overhead that's associated with that person, rent, heat, travel, training, IT people, finance people, HR people, seniors, senior C-suite level salaries, et cetera, it turns out that agencies spend about the same amount on overhead as they do on the salaries of the client-facing people.
Okay,
so
it's like 1-to-1.
It's like a 1-to-1.
Yeah.
I mean, it varies by agency, but kind of traditionally it was 1-to-1. So under the labor-based system, agents who were saying, okay, we're going to have X number of people on the account, their cumulative salaries are this, let's put a number on it, let's say $1 million, okay? To that, we will add $1 million of overhead on a 1-to-1 basis, and then we expect a 15% profit margin. And so we will up the rates to cover our profit. And they were negotiating those numbers with procurement in the early days of the fee arrangements. And procurement was saying, well, I think that your average salary is too high and we're not going to pay that rate. And they would say, oh, and we have data that says that your overhead rate shouldn't be 100%, it should be 90%. And we're not going to let you make a 15% profit margin because we only make a 5% margin. And those kind of horse trading things went back and forth. There were benchmarking consultants that were feeding clients all kinds of, let's say, interesting data that would allow them to negotiate that way. And agencies just took it on the chin. They wanted the clients. The client had its so-called benchmarks, and, they never got paid the full amount for the man hours they were putting in. On top of it, there was more work than the man hours they were being paid for. So it was kind of a double whammy. They were both getting rates that were inadequate, and they were getting volumes that were inadequate. And it's just kind of been that way for the last 30 years. It slides a little bit more every year, in which case agencies respond by firing people at the year end in order to make their margin. It's just not a healthy situation.
So we start with people's salaries. That's 1. We start with overhead. That's 2. It's a 1-to-1. We want to make a 15% profit. These are kind of like known things in the agency world.
Yeah.
I'm not I've worked at agencies. I've never been on like kind of the financial side. I'm just head down doing my work. But I really love these. I love learning about these like different kind of like hard ratios for like profitability. I know you have your MBA. I have my MBA. Like part of us, like I'm a creative, but I'm also a business guy, and I love hearing about this stuff.
Yeah. Well, Let's just say in the early days of before the holding companies started buying up every agency that moved, beginning in the 80s. Excuse me. Agencies were publicly owned, but they were independent of holding company ownership. Ogilvy, JWT, Wine, all those agencies were publicly quoted. Now, they made so much money under the commission system where they were getting 15% of a client's media spend. That was the industry policy. They made so much money that they could have had 60% margins, but they didn't dare show those margins to their shareholders or to their clients. So what agencies did in the old days is they doubled and trebled the staff to do the work so that they only showed 5 to 10% profit margins. And that's why when the holding companies came in the 80s, they knew very well that the agencies were very, very overstaffed. So the first thing a holding company would do with an Ogilvy, they'd start cutting because that would drive up the holding company margins and drive up the holding company share price. And it didn't really hurt the agencies. They had plenty of resources. I was in business at that time, and for my first 15 years, I helped agencies downsize to prove that they had more people than they needed to do the work. That all shifted in 2004 because by 2004, all the surpluses were gone. Agencies were used to showing 5% margins, 5 to 10% margins to their shareholders and to their clients. When the holding companies came in, beginning in the 80s, they wanted a 10% margin across the board. And today, they want somewhere between a 17 and a 20% margin.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah, that's just the way it goes when you look at the earnings call. You know, they're all looking to generate 15% margins. It's not easy to do. The only way they can do it is to downsize enormously, which of course hurts their talent pool. So
right. And I have a lot of people on the podcast, and a recurring kind of technique for staffing is to, it's almost like high tide when you have a lot of business. And then when you don't have a lot of business, it's low tide in terms of spending. And there's all these like gig workers and kind of, so it's a very mobile talent pool.
Yeah. And, listen, a smart agency working in that environment will not staff up to do all the work 100%. They'll always use some percentage of freelancers because that gives them capacity, flexible capacity. But today, agencies are seriously understaffed.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have enough people to do the work. Well, I know this because, look, my business is measuring the work they do. And I've been doing this for over 30 years. So I have some understanding of what it takes. And I've got a very formal model that measures the amount of work they're doing and the number of people they have on it, what the productivity of those people have to be. The real issue here is how many deliverables of a standard type does a creative have to do? I had to develop a workload unit called the scope metric unit, which is about the size of a TV ad, a TV origination ad. And I've learned over the years that a creative in a well-run relationship can do 5 a year, 5 of those. Well, I go and measure workloads of ad agencies, and I find that their creatives doing not 5, they're doing 10, 12, 15, because the fees are so low and the workloads are so great that the few people that are there to do the work have to really crank out a lot of work. And I think that affects the quality. I think the quality isn't very good. And clients who underpay their agencies are not going to get the quality of work they need. That'll lead them in 3 years to fire the agency and look for someone even cheaper and have the same phenomenon. So, it really is important for both parties that agencies know what the work is, know what the work can actually affect brand performance, know that they're going to be paid properly so they can put the right kind of people on the work. And if all that happens, there's a much higher probability that the work will deliver some growth. But that hasn't been the case now for the last 15 years. You can analyze that, Adam, just by going to any public source of data on publicly quoted companies. I use macrotrends.net, which has a database of the sales, the stock market performance, the dividends paid, and everything for practically every quoted company in the world. And you just have to look at their sales. The sales of 20 of the top 50 advertisers in the last 15 years have not grown at all. 20
Say
of the
that.
top 50 advertisers have shown almost no growth for the last 15 years, whereas in the previous 50 years, they grew at 5 to 8% per year. I mean, there's just been a very dramatic change in the rate at which legacy brands, the ones that we, have seen in the supermarket years and years and years, at the rate at which they've grown, it's really changed a lot. So I think that a lot of it has to do with an overinvestment in digital and social media, an underinvestment in agencies, too junior people at agencies doing the work, and so forth and so on. It's become a cost-driven business instead of a performance-based business, I think, by most advertisers and their agencies.
I think we live in a society that is very much in line with that type of mentality of like, do it as cheap as possible, do it on a cost basis, not a performance basis. We have fast fashion. And so it sounds like talking about like, can I call your company an agency? Would you call it that?
No. I'm a consulting firm.
Consulting.
I happen to have a particular expertise in the problems of advertisers and their agencies, but it's still a strategy consulting firm. I'm still thinking about how they organize their resources to get more performance at a fair cost.
And so I hear you talking about like kind of the more larger agencies. Is that typically who you work with, or what are your metrics for?
No, I work with, the whole independent agencies have got the same problem, the smaller independent agencies, and I've worked with plenty of them. In fact, I'll be honest with you, I kind of prefer working with them. They're owner operated in many cases. They have more stability in their senior management team. Many of them are privately owned, so they're not under the quarterly
bureaucracy,
the quarterly performance pressure that all the publicly quoted agencies are under. And I think the other thing is they're more entrepreneurial and they understand the business much better than the people that are running the big agencies. The big agencies, let's face it, they're in the business of making money for the holding company. They are not in the business of delivering improved performance for their clients. I'm just saying that's a fact. Their job, one, make your budget every quarter. And if you don't, downsize. That's the way it's gone. And there's plenty of evidence of that from all the earnings calls of the last 30 years demonstrate that holding companies are about cost reduction and making the numbers. That's how they pay their bonuses, by the way, is if people make their numbers based on how good they are with their clients. And, interestingly enough, I come from a BCG and Bain background, but the consulting firms do a much better job at this. Consulting firms from the get-go are all about doing studies that deliver performance for their clients, because that's the only way that consulting firms can justify the colossally high fees they charge. They charge more than 5 times as much as agencies per head. They pay at least a 5 times multiple on the salaries of their people. And their people are a lot more expensive than agency people. Agencies are lucky to get a 2 times, if they get salary plus overhead in a minor margin, they're getting a 2.2 multiple on the cost of their people. The consulting firms get a 5 to 6. Why? Because they deliver improved performance. So I wish that agencies would spend more time thinking about what the consulting firms do and the way they establish their mission and the way they price their services, because there's a lot to be learned there.
Yeah. Well, I would love to hear more about like your specific consultancy firm. I went on your website. It looks like you have CEO Michael Farmer. You also have, I think he's director of operations or COO. How large is your consultancy firm?
We're not large at all. We're under 10 people. I've used the same.
I wouldn't expect anything more from a paying consultant. I wouldn't expect you to have this large oversized company.
No, but the thing is, Adam, that the relationships that we work on are pretty intense. We're not trying to work, with 100 different clients. We'll work with 2 at a time because it's very intense. It's very intense to try to reconstruct the work they're doing and to classify the deliverables. and to do the modeling and then convince people throughout the organization that this is their reality and this is how they need to work differently. It's very hands-on and very personal consulting once we've done the data analysis. And the data analysis can take close to 2 months just to get the data. Just to reconstruct what agency A is doing for client B, can take up to 7 weeks or so because the information that we have to work with is very poor or it's sort of random. So we have to get it. We have to model it. We have to then go back throughout the client organization and show them what it is and how we got there and what it means for them. And then to think through what they ought to do about it if they want to do anything about it at all. So listen, we do the same thing. We go in and we say, if you want to improve your performance, we have to take a look at 3 things: how much work you're doing for each client, what you get paid, and how many people it takes. And then we will develop a better understanding of the work they're doing, deliverable by deliverable. When I did the holding company agency a couple of years ago and found out that 50 creatives were doing 15,000 deliverables, at that time, we were the only people that knew that. It took quite a bit of communication to convince them they were actually doing that amount of work, that many different deliverables, and that of the 15,000 things they were doing, 13,000 of them were pure adaptations of about 2,000 original pieces of work. So the story was, you are doing 2,000 pieces of work. You are adapting that work 13,000 times. Therefore, you're doing 15,000 deliverables. And those adaptations represent 40% of your man hours. Now, here comes AI, right? Here comes AI ready to do all those deliverables, at least the adaptations, with very, very few man hours attached to them. And that could be kissing goodbye anything between 0 or 40% of the revenue at that office. My guess is that 20% of that revenue is at risk. So gee, if that's the case, you better do something because you're going to lose. Clients are going to definitely go in there and say, hey, if you're using AI for this stuff, we're not going to pay you what we've been paying you, $70 an hour or $100 an hour or $150 an hour or whatever it is. We're not going to pay that unless you tell us how few man hours you're going to be using to do the AI. So there's an existential threat. Right now.
I've seen models with agencies who are kind of right on that AI boom, and they're developing their own GPTs that will kind of take on their workload, and they're actually charging less for it. So they're stepping in front of that wave, and they're actually saying like, this is a tool we use. It's going to speed up our work hours, so we're going to, charge you less.
Good for them. But if I'll tell you who won't be doing that. WPP, IPG, Omnicom, Dentsu, Publicis. Why? Look, this year, WPP had to revise its revenue growth figures. And they said, it's not going to be what we thought it was. We're expecting a 3 to 5% decline for the full year. Their stock price took a hammering. The chief executive took a hammering. That was a 5% variation. Right? The kind of variation that I'm looking at, given the huge number of adaptations that are being done by agencies, is a lot more than 5%. And I don't know a publicly held company that could suffer a 20% decline in revenue without losing a chief executive, a chief financial officer, and a lot of other people, and maybe be broken up by Wall Street. We're saying the parts are worth more than the whole. So, listen, the industry was in an existential crisis before AI, and AI is just gasoline on the fire. It's just going to accelerate the pressures on fees that have already been present through, I think, poor management practices, not keeping track or charging for the work. So it's going to be a very interesting time, Adam, in the next 2 years. I tell you, I don't know how the holding companies are going to deal with it, but they certainly need to do something to put a floor under their fees, despite their bragging that they're going to be using AI for everything.
Yeah.
Listen,
Everybody's going to
Street,
be using AI.
Well, yeah, I know, but share performance, stock price performance is based on Wall Street on really two basic things: the growth of sales and the growth of margins. If you get growing sales and growing margins, Wall Street gives you a very high PE ratio and your stock price grows. If you're not growing your sales, you can still get a 5% per year share price growth if you increase your dividends, do share buybacks, cut your costs. But if your margins are flat and your sales aren't growing, the share price is going to take a tumble. And if
Yeah.
a share price takes a tumble, that affects the compensation for a lot of people, particularly the chief executive, and a lot of other people are bonused with share arrangements. And on top of it, it makes you vulnerable to a takeover by somebody if your stock price is dropping. So listen, the holding companies really cannot suffer share price declines at this point. And yet AI is going to come in and steal an awful lot of man hours. So I personally have no idea how they're going to handle it. IPG and Omnicom are handling it by merging and telling the world they're going to take $750 million out of their cost base. Well, that to me means they're going to juniorize even more. I'm
Yeah.
not sure they'll be able to maintain their share price growth and their sales growth under the new scenario.
Yeah. We have 10, 15 minutes left. I want to kind of switch gears and I want to talk about your consultancy firm. How long have you been in business?
Since 92, so a little over
92,
30
yeah.
years.
Are you guys, a lot of the people that I bring on this podcast, they're agency people. You're kind of like the first consultancy firm that I've spoken to. And of the issues that I'm kind of seeing are growth related with a lot of agencies. Everybody's kind of stuck in this referral process. I'm curious for your consultancy firm, like what do you use? How do you get new clients? Are you kind of still on like the referral? You've been in the game for a long time. Your Rolodex is probably huge. Are you doing any like outbound stuff? How are you acquiring clients?
I'll tell you, I I write an article every week on Substack. So, I've counted up. I've done about 150 articles over the last several years. I've written 2 books, and I'm writing a 3rd one right now. I do podcasts like this, Adam. I get invited to speak at conferences because my books are pretty well known. But the thing is, I don't do outbound marketing other than what I write and doing podcasts and giving speeches and the like, because the real variable is not having people know that what I do or that I have expertise in it. The real issue today is, where are the chief executives that want to do something different for whom I am the right resource? And there aren't many people that do what I do. And it's just because I learned about this business in a funny way. I came from nowhere with industrial consulting experience, and I applied that to the agency business and learned that their number one problem was the way they price their services. So there aren't many people that do what I do, but it isn't a shortage of expertise within the consulting community that is the driver. The shortage is of leaders that want to do something different because, like I described with Matt Baxter at Huge, it is a big job to decide we're going to be paid on a different basis. We're going to have a different mission. We're going to have to think about ourselves in an entirely different way. And Huge had 12 global offices. So, bringing about an alignment within the total top management organization, that's a big job. It took Matt a couple of years to do it. He did not make his numbers for IPG while he was doing that. That sort of irritated them. Bottom line, he ended up leaving and Huge got sold. IPG sold it to a private equity firm because they weren't in the agency transformation business. They were in the agency making their numbers business. That's kind of a problem. If you are a holding company agency, chief executive, your job is to make your numbers. Farmer doesn't help you do that. Farmer helps you think about how you are surviving in 5 years. And there may be a bit of a disruption in making your numbers in the short term. Huge, as an example, Adam, was trying to go from 180 clients that were relatively small and pretty random to 50 really good ones, right? So they were out there trying to make their numbers from the 180 while they were out there looking for new clients, and in some cases, not renewing client relationships. It's tough. The transformation job is a tough one. Changes in pricing and selling it to each of your clients, getting your organization aligned, developing the methodology for pricing on deliverables, all of that is complicated stuff at a time when the airplane is flying, it's the numbers have to be made. So it's easier to look to the independent agency community, those who aren't publicly owned, for the kind of leadership that will lead to transformations. And that's an easier go of it. But I'll tell you, the scarce resource, I think, is C-suite talent. That's why I call my Substack C-suite blues, because, I have the blues over there not being enough executives out there that want to deal with their problems in an adult way. I'm very discouraged by the fact that agencies will deal with their pricing problem by firing people to make their margin. That really bothers me.
And I'm sure a lot of people don't want to do that, because if you have a good company, your employees should feel pretty close to them.
Yeah. But I'll tell you, the holding companies have gone down that route now. They've been doing it for 30 years.
Right.
That's their drug of choice. It's quick. It's easy. You give pig slips out, in the fourth quarter of the year. You put a hiring freeze on in the first quarter of the year. That's what's going on. I mean, just read the press. Just Google agency downsizing news and find out.
I know about it firsthand, I think.
You know
I
about
think
it
a lot of
firsthand. You've been on the raw side of it, right?
I think a lot of people have. I mean, it's just so fluid. But, if you had like one last kind of message to say to the podcast viewers, what would you say? What would you want to say?
Well, if I'm speaking to agencies, I will say this. Don't solve a pricing problem by managing costs. If you have a pricing problem, and you all do, deal with it by being paid for the work you do, not for some guess at man hours in an environment where you don't know how much work you're doing. So I think getting the remuneration change done first is the route to health. And that means gathering and documenting and measuring your workloads. I happen to have a system for that because I needed to develop one for me when I was in my early consulting days in the industry. I have this what's called scope metric system, which is a way of gathering the deliverables, classifying the deliverables, putting them into a model, and having the model give me the metrics that I need. So it's not like the technology doesn't exist to do it. What doesn't exist are enough people that actually want to take this on. They'd much rather give the pink slips out. At least the holding companies would. Independent agencies are in a different situation. They're kind of fun to work with, too. I mean, because the owner-operators been around for a while. They understand what's going on.
Yeah,
they're kind of appalled at the holding company behavior, which has an influence on how some of the clients treat them, too.
Yeah.
So, Adam, key lesson, don't solve a pricing problem by reducing your costs. That's a bad idea.
Yeah, and Mr. Farmer can help with that. So, thanks so much, Michael, and thank you for coming on the pod and sharing your expertise. And hopefully this will kind of add to the movement that you've been trying to create.
Good. Adam, delighted, lovely talking with you, and I'm very happy to be speaking with your listeners as well. Thank you for having me.
You got it.